all the very good presentation as usual on the economy, the context within which we face these difficult times. I believe I should start by acknowledging that the Jamaica Labour Party is very much seized of the critical challenges that the Jamaican economy faces today. We don't underplay them, and we see ourselves as playing a very critical role in the recovery of the economy. We see ourselves as part and parcel of the solution. We are not about to play a nightmare role. We don't want to do anything to destabilize the country, and we are not being obstinate and presenting any obstacles for the government. We must all accept, however, that the opposition has a role of oversight. If the government is doing something wrong, the opposition must sound the alarm. Within this context, we decided as an opposition that we would cooperate, participate, and where necessary, give critical support. You will notice the stark difference in response to a debt exchange. When the Jamaica Labour Party 3 years ago decided that it was necessary to execute a debt exchange, the response of the then opposition was to object strenuously. They labeled it a default. Very irresponsible. We have, however, taken a very different approach, where we gave cautious support, because the debt exchange executed now is against a different context than the debt exchange executed then. But the objective of reducing the national debt is still the same. So we agree with the objective. You have to reduce the national debt. Our issue is always with timing and sequencing. You must bear in mind that you are conducting a debt exchange in an environment of great uncertainty, declining confidence. When we executed the debt exchange, there was economic stability. The present government is executing a debt exchange with a dollar that is sliding and reserves that are depleting rapidly. That has an impact. And the government must also bear in mind that this is the second debt exchange. The market will receive it in a tentative way in the short term. But in the long term, effectively, bondholders and investors are going to make changes to their long-term portfolio decisions. In effect, what will happen in the long term is that people will be shying away from Jamaican dollar-denominated instruments to look for safer ground. My other great worry with this debt exchange is not just the shift in currency in terms of portfolio decisions, but the shift in location. So it's one thing to move from one currency to the next. It's another thing when that currency is in flight, seeking other destinations for safety. So we have to be cautious about it. So we agree with the objective, and we give cautious support, but we also have a duty to point out to the government that if you do this, please bear in mind the effects that could happen as a result. And we have done that without talking down the markets or affecting the take-up of the debt offer. So we were prepared to participate in anything that makes sense in achieving the national objective of reducing the debt. I have been at pains to say that the problems the JLP experienced were not JLP problems, and the problems that the PNP are now experiencing are not PNP problems. We have national problems, and it requires a national consensus. It requires leadership that can build trust. It requires leadership that creates a framework of participation and cooperation. we were slapped in the face literally on Tuesday in Parliament when the taxation bomb was dropped. You know, an important part of getting through this difficult period is how leadership brings everybody to the table. You know, when I was making my presentations to the nation and explaining the position of the opposition, and then to hear ridiculous comments being made when I'm merely executing my constitutional role, I was prepared to ignore trivia. So when we got a call to visit Vale Royal, we gladly accepted. There were those who said, no, you shouldn't go because, you know, quite a bit of disrespect has been shown to you and it will diminish your position, but I don't stand on ceremony for these things. It's not about me, it's about Jamaica. And Ollie and myself turned up promptly. Willing to participate, willing to share, willing to play our role in coming to the solution. Prime Minister did not turn up, sent apologies. Again, we don't stand on ceremony. We want to play our part, play our role. We got a brief from the Minister of Finance and the other members of the civil service who were there. On our way out, we saw the private sector members who would have been probably given a similar brief. We came to Parliament quite well prepared, gave instructions to the PAAC chairman that we should expedite the review of the supplementary budget, all in our role of cooperating and participating, moving everything through very quickly. And then to hear of this tax package. This is a breach of trust. This is a failure in governance. You can't be asking people in your public statements, it is time for the country to unite and all stakeholders must get on board, and then you turn around and slap them in the face as you have done with this tax package. This is the second breach of trust and the second failure of governance of this government. The first is to ask persons to make sacrifice when ostensibly, visibly, you are not prepared to make any of your own. You are going to ask the unions to take a wage freeze, but you are not prepared to take a wage cut. You are going to ask unions and workers to absorb sacrifices, but you are not prepared to drive the old vehicles you inherited. You dismiss it as mere symbolism, but it is symbols that build trust. You must bear some of the sacrifices yourself. Because when the householder who worked hard, purchased their home, invested in a life insurance policy, or a pension plan, and now they are being asked to take a second cut in the income that will be generated from those plans. It may be small for the individual pensioner, householder, but collectively it contributes to the national solution. So don't come to me with this silly argument that what the government will take in a salary cut is small. I'm certain it will be larger than any individual bondholder now. Government must make sacrifices of its own. the political party that forms the government must make the sacrifice as well. So, this is the second breach of good governance principles. But let's put that aside. It is going to be very difficult for the government to repair the breach in trust. And I think people are still looking on very suspiciously on the government if they are very serious about change and reform. But let's put that aside. Let's look at some of the fundamental issues that Audley has raised, and I won't go into them in detail, but I will just place a perspective on that. Everyone agrees we are in crisis. We were exposed in 2009, 2008 to the worst recession of the century. Worst recession in the last 70 years. It exposed Jamaica. It exposed our bloated economy, our unsustainable debt, our high deficits, our inefficiencies, our low productivity. We were then the government and we put in place an economic plan. The economic plan was accepted and we signed a letter of intent with the IMF. We had an IMF deal. We began executing some of those prior actions. We did have our challenges. These are not easy things to do. These are not things that governments take lightly because it calls for readjustment, it calls for great sacrifice. We recognize that there would have been and there needs to be some amount of austerity. But we also recognize that we must put in place a growth inducement strategy. Now, when people hear talk about austerity, they immediately say, well, hardships. Austerity would be those policies that contract government, increase government's take out of the economy through taxes, and redistribute or readjust incomes. Growth inducement would be those policies that reduce regulation, simplify regulation, gives incentives for investment, and gives more money for people to spend. The challenge that any government faces is how do you balance austerity, which are those policies that you would want to cater towards reducing your debt and your deficit, and growth inducement, which are those policies needed to increase the size of your economy. This government is not seized of the distinction between the two policies. This government does not understand how it can be done. This government is merely focused on a crisis. They are not focused on the opportunity that the crisis presents. This government does not understand economy. It does not understand the free market. It does not understand business. It does not understand investment. This government is way over their heads. It took them 1 year and a month to reach to this point. And during the point of delay, the targets that they have to meet to satisfy signing a deal, those targets are increasing. The national debt has increased, and therefore the primary surplus target must increase. The economic variables indicators have deteriorated in the time that they have wasted. So a part of the problem that we are experiencing now and the hardships that we are being asked to bear is as a result of the delay in action by the government. And that is a point that must not be underestimated. That is a point that must be made over and over and over and over again. Delay is deadly for the economy. And that is what we are experiencing now. But there are some other points to be made. If you are in this crisis, and this crisis requires adjustment, sacrifice. So we need to reduce the debt, we need to reduce our deficits, we need to cut our expenditure. What is it that you are going to offer persons in exchange for that sacrifice? Where is the hope? We hear about all kinds of investments to come. And they are good. They will help. But they will not help significantly. We have already seen many investments coming into Jamaica. And it has not impacted on growth. Why? Because there are some fundamental issues that have to be addressed in our economy. So this government has put in place a tax package, an austere tax package, a tax package that gives no hope. Remember, the government in May last year came with a significant tax package, $23 billion annualized. And now they come with another huge tax package. And I want to reinforce the point that Audley made. The $11 billion in addition to the 16 is effectively a tax. It is effectively a tax. That $11 billion coming from the energy. Now, the question is, where is the growth inducement strategy? If you're coming with austerity, where is the growth inducement strategy? Where is the growth? Otherwise, all you will be doing is killing the economy. And we have been at pains to explain this to the government. Taxation is not tax reform. What the government has come with is taxation. Now, there is a way in which you can use growth inducement strategies to improve your economy. You hear people talk about this thing, the debt to GDP ratio. The debt on top, GDP at the bottom. You can either reduce the debt, that is, reduce the top number, or increase the bottom number, which is the GDP. So you have to do both strategies. We only hear one. Reduce the top number. Now, here's the problem. Once you reduce the top number, which is the debt, you are also going to reduce the economy. Once you start to take out income from people, whether through debt exchange or through taxes, it means people are going to spend less, people are going to invest less, you're going to have less jobs, your economy is going to contract, and you're going to be back at square one. You're going to still have a high debt to GDP ratio. So when you're executing policy, you must do both at the same time. And the economists will tell you, policy is about time, timing, and sequencing. You have to put the policy at the right time. So you have to do it when the moment calls for it. Then you have to do the sequencing and the timing. You can't execute all the policies at once. There are some policies that you have to do first, and then you come with another policy. The Jamaica Labour Party can't be compared with the PNP. And I must just say on the side, because I'm hearing all kinds of discussions saying we are all the same. We are not the same. We would not have come with a JDX group. It's not the right time. The policy that should have come first is fundamental tax reform. Fundamental tax reform is not part of the austerity package. That's part of the growth inducement package. When we were in government, we already went through some austerity. We divested Air Jamaica because getting rid of loss-making enterprises was one of the low-hanging fruits. You do that first. The next thing you do, we did then our debt exchange. We went through that already. The time that you are at now is tax reform time, and the government simply did not understand it. Why were we at tax reform time? Finally, we had major consensus from the private sector. They were the ones who spent quite a bit of resources, admirably so, to bring to the table a proposal. Government lost that opportunity. What the government presented as tax reform is rubbish. Fundamental reforms necessary, and therefore tax reform should have been done within the first 2 or 3 months after the election. You would have been in a better place, because tax reform is not about more taxes. It is about simplifying your tax system, increasing your tax base. In effect, tax reform creates the incentives for growth. We hear the minister talk about removing waivers, and all they allude to it. You have to have a comprehensive vision, right? Our policy was to reduce rates in the critical areas that drive economy, and then that would in effect reduce the demand for waivers. Now we hear the minister hiking up taxes and at the same time saying, well, we're going to take away waivers. How business going to function? How business going to function? It is just incoherent planning and policy. The framework has to be first and foremost, bring down the rates, increase compliance. We may have to very well look at things such as a major tax amnesty and forgiveness to encourage persons to come into the tax net. You may very well have to look at properly utilizing all the funds that have been given to us in terms of improving tax reform and tax collection and tax administration. You may very well have to look at putting in place a national identification system to properly document and identify all citizens of Jamaica. Those are the things that form part of policy reform of what we call growth inducement. So I don't want people to think that we could not have done it any better or different. That's not the case. We had a framework that meant reducing taxation. And you know why it is important? The country is already at its taxable limit. These taxes, majority of them will be collected. Let's take, for example, the tax on dividend. Just to show you that government doesn't understand it. We developed the junior stock exchange. It was a means of getting equity into investment. Not debt, but equity into investment. This is what's going to kill it. What will happen is that companies are going to declare far less dividend. You're going to effectively kill your stock market. Why this tax? Why? Let's look at the transaction tax and transfer tax. That was needed to spur the construction industry, spur real estate development. What is the signal that this sends? Let's take NHT. Now, great debate about NHT having significant reserves. It is true, they do have significant reserves. Part of that significant reserve buildup is because they are heavily invested in government paper. Heavily invested in government paper. Now, the NHT gets 3 sources of income. 4, but we focus on 3. They get the employer's contribution, they get the employee's contribution, and they get returns from mortgages they make. They get income from investments that they make as well. It is important to note that by law, the employee's contributions cannot be touched. It belongs to the employees. The employer's contribution and those that they get from investments are available for investment generally in housing and community development. It is indeed a far stretch for the government to now go and take $11 billion per year for the next year, $44 billion to use to reduce the debt. We question the legality of it, and we are examining it now, and we make the public call that the government should also seek the advice of the Solicitor General on this matter. We are of the view that it is illegal. It is either they change the law or abandon that course. But just to be clear,
before you move on to the housing question, can I just say one thing? It's important that you know, the leader has said it. How do they physically get these cash resources of $45 billion over 4 years? That $90 billion I mentioned to you of equity, how is it broken down right now? $70 billion of that equity is the loan portfolio. Another $15 billion or so is government paper. And the other $5 billion an assortment of income or equity somewhere. The government will have to explain, and that those are 2011 audited figures. So the government will have to explain precisely what the mechanism of how they're going to retrieve that 45 billion in cash.
It shows clearly just an incoherence, lack of thought, lack of planning. Which leads me back to my original point. Had they consulted, had they sought advice in keeping with their own pronouncements, we have to look at some other things as well. I don't want it to be said that the opposition is just being critical. In my presentation, we have given solutions. We have given advice. I want to close my remarks by saying that we are disappointed that we will not have a chance to meet with the IMF. The meeting that we had was cancelled. I don't know what that signals. But the Jamaica Labour Party, the constituted parliamentary opposition, will not support the government in going down this road. We believe it is destructive to the economy, it is destructive to investment, and at the end of the day, it destroys the chance, the hopes, the aspirations and ambitions of the average Jamaican to fight their way out of poverty. This measure and this government is impoverishing the nation.
Thank you, Leader. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're open for questions. Please give your name and your house. I will start with
I hope you can hear me on the platform. Okay. I want to look at the growth deliverables. Mr. Holness, you said JLP government would use as its linchpin tax reform as an inducement towards growth. What other areas do you see, or did you plan to use as inducement towards growth?
Well, first I should point out to you that the administration of which I was a part and led for a period of time clearly focused on growth. What we did was to ask the PIOJ under its former director and well-known and renowned professors. I'm answering your question. Answered the call for how do we get growth by developing a growth inducement strategy. It is now a book and published, and I would urge Jamaicans and the journalists as well, very good reading, to get that book. That's number one. As I said before, you are now at the time when tax incentives and tax reform would be the correct thing to do. In fact, it should have been done a year ago. Let's look at them carefully. We all agree that we need to improve tax administration. Some work is going on, but I believe the work there is very slow. We all agree that we need to improve and widen the tax base. How do you do that? How do you widen the tax base? You don't widen the tax base by increasing taxes. In effect, it becomes more iniquitous on those who are already trapped in the base. They are being asked to pay more and more. To deal with the culture of informality, two things are necessary. One, the government must show a credible face that it will collect taxes. And two, it must provide a general amnesty and forgiveness. That is something that should be looked at very seriously. So for those persons who are out of the tax net, to encourage them to come in, you must first present a credible threat that you are going to collect, you're going to get to them. But you must also say, we will forgive you. At this point, you start at zero, no penalties, we're not going to go back, we're going to go forward. Give a general amnesty. And I think that is something that should be considered up front. The other thing in looking at tax reform is actually bringing down the rates, especially at customs and general. And I say this because, as I said earlier, we are at the point where we have reached our taxable limit. Bringing down the rates would actually improve your tax scheme. It is a risk, but governments have to be brave. When we say governments have some difficult decisions to take, this would be one of them. We weren't proposing to come and dump more tax on persons, right? It is a difficult decision to take to reduce the rates. But if you take it at the right time, when persons are optimistic, when you have high trust and credibility with the government, and when people see growth, you will see greater compliance. Let's look at some other things that need to be done to induce growth, because it's not just about your tax system. And of course, reducing your tax rates would obviate the need for waivers. Because in many respects, the reason why you have the waiver is because the rates are so high in the first place, which just doesn't make sense. But let's look at something simple as improving the efficiency of your bureaucracy. Not much is said or done about improving the business processes of government. People complain all the time about how long it takes to get approval, the difficulty in doing transactions with government. We are in the bottom of the list when it comes to efficiency in business. Right? We are at the bottom of that. So when we were the government, we put in place right away something called the Directorate of Public Efficiency, Public Sector Efficiency. That is something that we took seriously. That's a policy that distinguishes us from the PNP. But let's look at another one that would induce growth, especially in the short term. Reduce energy costs. Right? Both governments have had difficulty with it. But the time to do it is now. There is consensus. People are agreed. Get in place a diversified fuel-based. It's not happening. And it is a confused policy. 1 minute you hear we're getting it, then you hear we're not getting it, then you hear we're going on to something. We're not getting the right signals there. Those are the things that you need to put in place to induce growth. I mean, I could go on and on. You need to look at education. That's a very important part of improving growth. But I'll stick with those since we are the three that I mentioned, since we're dealing with the economy now.
Another quick question. Mr. Shaw mentioned that